At 2:17 a.m., the lights went out, and the Titanic was no longer a ship. It was 50,000 tons of steel about to rip itself in half. For over a century, we have been told a version of this story that borders on myth, a dramatic 45-degree plunge into the abyss. But the truth of the breakup is something the world wasn't supposed to see. It was a structural betrayal that began long before the final plunge. And today, we are going inside the final minutes, using forensic evidence that settles the debate once and for all. To understand why 1,500 people were caught off guard, you have to understand the illusion of the deck. The Titanic was designed with a pronounced upward curve at the bow and stern, known as shear. Throughout the night, as the bow dipped into the Atlantic, this design actually masked the angle of the sinking. By 2:10 a.m., the ship was already down by nearly 10 degrees, but to the passengers standing on deck, it felt almost level. They were standing on a mathematical line of no return, yet most believed they still had hours. Beneath their feet, the unsinkable was already dead. In the boiler rooms, the engineers were performing a final, desperate act of heroism. They weren't just keeping the lights on for comfort. They were damping the boilers to prevent massive steam explosions the moment the freezing seawater hit the red-hot steel. If those boilers had detonated, the ship would have vanished in a heartbeat. Because of them, the ship stayed a refuge for just a few minutes longer, even as the ocean began to roar through cargo hatches and vents, moving from a slow leak to a tidal wave. This is where the movie version fails us. Most people believe the Titanic reached a towering cinematic height before snapping. But new forensic analysis of the double-bottom ribbons of steel found at the wreck site tells a different story. The Titanic didn't break at 45 degrees. The structure actually failed at a shallow angle of just 11 degrees. This was a Stage 2 breakup. The top decks began to tear apart while the keel was still mostly submerged. It wasn't a clean snap. It was a violent, grinding failure of every beam and rivet. And the sound was unlike anything heard in maritime history. Survivors didn't describe a single roar. They described a symphony of destruction. It began with a sound like a gunshot as the steel cable stays of the forward funnel snapped. That 4-story funnel then tumbled like a drunk through the air, crushing dozens of people in the water. Then came a dull roar, like a locomotive passing through a subway tunnel. It was the sound of the ship's back breaking, of millions of rivets popping simultaneously under impossible tension. As the ship split, the human experience became a nightmare of physics and geography. While the first-class passengers were ushered toward the lifeboats, the third-class passengers were running into a physical and mechanical trap. It wasn't just social malice, it was the architecture of the ship. U.S. immigration laws required iron gates to separate classes to prevent the spread of disease. And in the chaos, those gates became a death sentence. By the time the orders came to open them, the corridors were already becoming vertical tunnels of rushing water. When the stern finally reared up for its last stand, the soundscape shifted again. This is a detail often missed in historical accounts. Survivors who had already made it to the lifeboats looked back and heard a sound they described as a football crowd cheering. It wasn't a cheer. It was the collective screams of over 1,000 people clinging to the final few feet of dry steel. They were huddled together in what one passenger called clumps of bees, waiting for an end that was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. At 2:20 a.m., the ocean finally closed over the stern. But the tragedy didn't end with the sinking. The force of the descent was so violent that the ship's internal machinery became unseated, crashing forward through bulkheads. As the stern fell toward the seafloor 2 miles below, the air trapped inside caused a series of secondary implosions, shredding the steel into the unrecognizable wreck we see today. The bow section kited away, landing nearly 2,000 feet from where the stern finally settled. The Titanic didn't just sink because of an iceberg. It sank because of a chain of overconfidence that started with an invisible horizon and ended with a structural failure that no one predicted. We often look at the wreck and see a monument to the past, but the real lesson is in those final minutes. Nature does not negotiate, and history rarely warns us twice. The silence that followed the sinking was the loudest sound of all, a reminder that the cost of arrogance is always measured in lives.